You unroll an old map and the first thing you notice isn't the coastline. It's the monster curling around the edge of it, a serpent with teeth like knives, a whale swallowing a ship whole. Somewhere near the blank part of the ocean, someone wrote a warning in Latin. You laugh a little. It looks like fantasy, but the person who drew it wasn't joking. For centuries, European mapmakers filled the unknown parts of the world with monsters. Krakens, sea serpents, giant crabs that could pull a ship under. Historians even have a name for the phrase that shows up again and again in the blank spaces. Here be dragons. Only 2 known maps actually use that exact Latin phrase, but the idea behind it shows up hundreds of times, in hundreds of forms, across 4 centuries of cartography. So why did serious, careful map makers, men who spent months measuring coastlines and calculating distances, choose to draw monsters instead of leaving the unknown simply blank? The answer isn't superstition, it's something closer to a warning label. Think about what a map actually was in the 1400s. It wasn't a tourist tool, it wasn't decoration. A map was one of the most valuable pieces of information a kingdom could own. Sailors used it to survive, kings used it to plan invasions, merchants used it to decide whether a voyage was worth the risk of losing everything. And here's the problem map makers faced. They didn't know what was out there. You have to imagine the edge of the known world as something almost physical. Sailors who ventured past the Canary Islands, past the edges of familiar currents, were entering water no European had charted. No one knew what waited beyond. No one knew if the ocean simply stopped. No one knew if there were storms so violent they could break a hull in half, or currents so strong a ship could never sail back. So what do you do as a map maker when you reach the edge of what you know? You could leave it blank. But a blank space on a map sends its own message. Safe, unremarkable, nothing here. And that message could get people killed. Instead, cartographers reached for the language everyone already understood. Fear. Medieval and early Renaissance mapmakers drew on centuries of maritime folklore, biblical imagery, and sailor testimony, some of it real, some of it exaggerated by months at sea and the human tendency to fill silence with story. The historian Chet Van Duzer, who has spent much of his career studying sea monsters on maps, has argued that these images weren't random decoration. They were functioning almost like hazard markers. A modern map might use a symbol for shallow reefs or dangerous currents. A 15th century map used a monster. It told the reader, this is uncharted, this is dangerous, proceed at your own risk. That single idea changes how you should look at every strange creature drawn into the corner of an old map. It's not fantasy for its own sake, it's risk communication centuries before the concept had a name. But there's a second layer to this, and it's just as important as the first. Monsters on maps weren't only about physical danger, they were about the limits of human knowledge itself. In medieval Christian thought, the edges of the known world were often linked to the edges of divine order. Civilization, the reasoning went, existed under God's structure. Cities, laws, agriculture, the church, all of it represented order imposed on chaos. But beyond the borders of the known world, that order broke down. What lived out there wasn't just physically dangerous, it was symbolically dangerous. It represented what existed outside of God's ordered creation. This is why so many sea monsters on old maps don't look like realistic animals at all. They look like theological warnings with fins, twisted proportions, human-like faces on serpent bodies, creatures that combine features from multiple animals in ways that feel deliberately unnatural. Scholars studying medieval bestiaries illustrated catalogs of real and imagined creatures that were extremely popular in monasteries, have noted that many sea monster illustrations borrowed directly from these bestiary traditions rather than from actual sailor reports. In other words, some of the most famous sea monsters on old maps weren't invented by explorers who saw something strange in the water. They were copied by artists working in a scriptorium who had never left dry land, pulling imagery from religious manuscripts about the nature of chaos and divine order. That reframes the whole picture, doesn't it? You start to realize the monsters on old maps are really two different things layered on top of each other. Some come from genuine reports, exaggerated by fear, distance, and imagination. Others come from an entirely separate tradition of religious art, repurposed to decorate the edge of the world. And then there's a third source, one that's easy to miss: actual biology, badly understood. Sailors really did see enormous creatures in open water, sperm whales, giant squid, which weren't scientifically confirmed to exist until the 1800s, despite centuries of sailor accounts describing them, basking sharks, which can grow over 30 feet long and have a mouth wide enough to look like it belongs to something far more dangerous than a filter feeder. Now, picture trying to describe one of these animals to someone back home, using only words, after seeing it for a few terrifying seconds in rough water, at a time when almost no one had any concept of a 30-foot fish that wasn't hunting you. That description gets passed to a mapmaker who has also never seen the ocean beyond a coastline. The mapmaker draws what the words suggest, and what comes out is a monster. This is how a real animal becomes a myth in 2 or 3 retellings, not through lying, through translation, through the simple human difficulty of describing the unfamiliar using only the familiar as a reference point. By the 1500s, something starts to shift. As exploration accelerates and more of the world's coastlines get charted, you'd expect the monsters to disappear, and in some ways they do, but in other ways they get more elaborate. The Carta Marina, a detailed map of Scandinavia published in 1539 by the Swedish clergyman Olaus Magnus, is covered in sea monsters, and Olaus Magnus didn't treat them as folklore. He wrote an accompanying book describing each creature in detail, drawing partly on actual reports from Scandinavian sailors and fishermen who worked in genuinely dangerous northern waters. His map became one of the most influential sources for how Europeans imagined the North Atlantic for the next century. Later mapmakers, working in workshops far from Scandinavia, copied his monsters directly onto their own maps of unrelated regions. Because they were vivid, they sold copies, and cartography at the time was as much a commercial art form as a scientific one. That's a detail worth sitting with. Some sea monsters on old maps aren't warnings about danger, and they aren't accidental misidentifications of whales. They're marketing. A map with a dramatic kraken curling around a coastline was simply a more compelling, more sellable object than a map with an empty patch of blue. So by the time you reach the height of the age of exploration, sea monsters on maps are doing at least 4 different jobs at once, marking genuine uncertainty and danger, carrying forward religious symbolism about the edge of divine order, reflecting distorted descriptions of real, poorly understood animals, and selling maps to wealthy buyers who wanted their walls to look impressive. Eventually, cartography changes. As the world gets measured more precisely, as naval institutions start producing charts based on standardized surveying instead of secondhand sailor reports, the monsters quietly disappear, not because someone declared them scientifically false, but because the function they served, marking the unknown, stopped being necessary. When you know what's actually there, you don't need a symbol for not knowing. Which brings you back to that unrolled map, the serpent curling around its edge, the warning written in Latin. It wasn't there to scare you for fun. It was there because someone, centuries ago, had to represent the limit of human knowledge using the only tools they had: fear, faith, half-remembered animal sightings, and a bit of salesmanship. The monster wasn't guarding the edge of the world. It was marking the edge of what people understood. And in a strange way, that's not so different from today. Every field still has its blank spaces, the places where knowledge runs out and uncertainty begins. We just don't draw dragons there anymore. We write data unavailable or further research needed. Same warning, different monster.